Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our next to last presentation in this fall's new lecture series. My name is Ann Lin. I'm the director of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies, and I'm really delighted that all of you are here today. This is our 9th presentation in the new lecture series. The complete series schedule is here and is also available on the LRCCS website. And if you're not on our email list, please feel free to let Ina know after the talk and she will put you on so you will get our weekly reminders. Important announcement first, next week is our last presentation in the fall 2025 new lecture series. Tuesday, November 9th, as usual, 12 noon. It's going to be given by Kanan Morse, who's a postdoctoral associate and lecturer in the Department of East Asian Cultures, of East Asian Languages, Literatures, and Cultures at the University of Virginia. He'll be speaking on the image of the book in the performance of reading, the drunken man's talk as a charter text. Kanan is, I will add my plug here, a just really wonderful both scholar of ancient Chinese history and literature, but also a translator of modern Chinese literature, and just a really interesting person. I'm delighted he's coming. Today's presentation is given by someone who I'm also delighted is here. Joe Torigian is Associate Professor in the School of International Service at American University in Washington, D.C. He's a Senior Fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations and a Center Associate at LRCCS. Previously, he was a Visiting Fellow at the China in the World program at Australian National University, a Stanton Fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations, a postdoctoral fellow at Princeton Harvard's China and the World program, a pre- and postdoctoral fellow at Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation, an IRIC scholar affiliated with the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, and a Fulbright scholar at Fudan University in Shanghai. And what is not here is your most important qualification, of course, which is that he was a very distinguished undergraduate at the University of Michigan, and we are always delighted to have you back. Joseph's first book was Prestige, Manipulation, and Coercion, Elite Power Struggles in the Soviet Union and China After Stalin and Mao. This was released with Yale University Press. His new book was published by Stanford University Press this year, 2025, and it's what he's going to talk about today. The Party's Interests Come First, The Life of Xi Zhongxun, father of Xi Jinping. Joseph, welcome back.
Well, let me begin first by saying what a thrill it is to be here. It's a home state talk. It's an alma mater talk. Ken Lieberthal was my first advisor. The center also helped pay for the book. They paid for the indexing, so it didn't come out of pocket. So a huge thank you to the center for that. I'm really thrilled also to give a talk here because many of the sources that you'll see in the footnotes are in the University of Michigan Library. As I'm sure all of you know, it's one of the best collections for Chinese materials anywhere in the world. And I spend a lot of time back home in Michigan, and I think that your interlibrary loan people are a little sore at me, but I didn't have to use them as much as I would at many other places because having be able to use your university library really was extraordinary and was essential for me to finish the book. The book, as you know, is a biography of Xi Zhongxun, the father of Xi Jinping. Xi Zhongxun was a prominent revolutionary and then a leading figure in the regime after it was established. So you might be a little surprised that I am going to begin my talk in the Midwest, not in Michigan, in Iowa, a place called the Amana Colonies, which is now known as a tourist destination with crafts and beer. The reason that I'm going to start in the Amana Colonies is because in 1980, when Xi Zhongxun was 67 years old, he led a delegation of Chinese governors to the United States. At the time, he was the party leader of the southern province of Guangdong, which was at the very forefront of China's new relationship with the outside world. The very first American consulate was built in Guangzhou, the provincial capital, when Xi Zhongxun was in Guangdong. And Xi Zhongxun also played a leading role in the creation of the special economic zones, the most famous physical manifestation of China's new era of reform and opening. When Xi Zhongxun visited the United States, the people who hosted him recalled that he was someone who was very charismatic, the kind of person who would also make sure that the translator had a glass of water. However, often he came across as distant, reserved, clearly someone with weighty issues on his mind. But this sense of distance went away entirely when Xi Zhongxun visited the Amana colonies. According to one person who was present, Xi Zhongxun literally became another person and was almost crawling across the table. And so we can surmise why he was so excited. One possibility is that he really liked the beer, and the beer is really good at the Amana colonies. I've been there. But I think the real reason it provoked such a strong reaction is he was listening to a tour guide tell a story about how a community of German immigrants who had created a society based on religious principles, decided 88 years after establishing their society to disband. In other words, Xi Zhongxun was hearing a story about how a religious society based on collectivist principles had become a tourist destination. And the explanation that you hear when you go to the Amana colonies is that one reason was that the founding generation who commanded total authority after they passed, their successors couldn't require the same kind of obedience, that a system of bureaucracy and privilege had emerged, that the collectivist organization of agriculture had proven inefficient because people were lazy, but that the main reason, the most important reason for why the Amana colonies collapsed was because of young people who were exposed to the outside world, who decided they wanted to live lives of consumerism and materialism, not lives based on religious sacrifice and collectivism, like their parents had taught them. And so let's reflect for a moment on what kind of a person was hearing this account. Xi Zhongxun was someone who sacrificed for the cause in extraordinary ways. This was someone who was arrested at 15 years old by the nationalists and joined the party while in jail. He was nearly killed on the battlefield fighting against the nationalists on several different occasions. During the revolution, he was arrested a second time, on this occasion by his fellow communists. Even after the communist victory of 1949, the suffering didn't cease. In 1962, he was purged from the leadership and subjected to 16 years of physical and emotional humiliation and punishment. And it was during the Cultural Revolution that one of his daughters tragically committed suicide. When Xi Zhongxun returned to work, he faced the question of whether what he and his comrades had sacrificed so much to build would survive, and it didn't look good, especially in the southern province of Guangdong. Tens of thousands of mainland Chinese were fleeing for the capitalist colony of Hong Kong because of economic hardship. Fears of Western ideological infiltration were stronger in Guangdong than elsewhere because it bordered Hong Kong. Young people who didn't think that China was moving away from the tragic legacy of the Cultural Revolution fast enough were protesting in the streets of Guangzhou. Hundreds of miles away, in places like Tibet and Xinjiang, ethnic minorities were protesting because of the extraordinary persecution that they faced during the Mao era. Even further afield in Poland, the solidarity protests were raising questions about the resilience of communism as a global phenomenon. And as Xi Zhongxun was listening to this tour guide in the Amana colonies, back in Beijing, a man named Deng Xiaoping was assuming the position as paramount leader, and he would demonstrate dictatorial and authoritarian tendencies that would deeply disappoint people like Xi Zhongxun, who had hoped that after the strongman years of Mao Zedong, China would escape from that tragic legacy. And so there's many ways to try to tie the threads of a man's life together for a brief book talk. But for the reasons I've begun to illustrate with this anecdote from Iowa, today I'm going to talk about the question of Xi Zhongxun and political order. How Xi Zhongxun thought about how to make sure the regime survived while he was alive, but also generations into the future. And that has obvious relevance for the real reason I know that you're here, which is his son happens to be the current president of the People's Republic of China. And so I'll proceed by talking about 5 issues: ideology, communism as a global phenomenon, ethnic politics, succession at the top, meaning within the elite, and conclude by talking about succession at the bottom, meaning young people. how the party has thought about how to win over new generations to the cause. But I'll begin with the question of ideology, because it's only with the sensitivity to the Bolshevik worldview will much of what else I have to say today make sense. And ideology speaks to the heart of the question of political order, because ideology is how the party explains what it's doing and why it deserves so much devotion. And as I talk about communism as ideology, I'll be careful because Ron Sunni is the room who knows more about this than anyone else. And so he can correct me if I get something wrong. And so you may wonder why Xi Zhongxun became interested in communism in the first place. Well, he was born into a milieu that inspired political radicalism. He was born in Shanxi province, which is where Qin Shi Huang forged the first unified Chinese state. And from nearby Xi'an, Chinese emperors had ruled for millennia. But by the time that Xi Zhongxun was born in 1913, 2 years after the collapse of the Qing dynasty, this had been a region rocked by many years of war and famine and banditry. It led to one of Xi Zhongxun's childhood friends to write in memoirs that it was a place of contradiction that made people develop a sort of extreme way of thinking. On the one hand, it has a rich cultural legacy, but on the other hand, the people face a difficult situation and the chaos of war never ends. But this didn't mean that Xi Zhongxun understood what communism was. He wasn't attracted to communism because he was inspired by Marx's ability to interpret class relations. In fact, he admitted that at the time, the situation allowed for all kinds of revolutionary books and newspapers for reading. But regrettably, because my individual study was too poor, if I read more, it only meant that there was more I did not understand. Because I was too young, my memory only allowed for half-baked knowledge, and my understanding of communism was still not deep. And of course, this raises a question, which is why was it possible for Xi Zhongxun to read this revolutionary literature? And the reason for that is, up until Xi Zhongxun was about 14, 15 years old, the communists were in an alliance with the nationalists, working with the nationalists to wrest the country away from the warlords. But famously, in April of 1927, the nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek betrayed the communists, and they were butchered and massacred all across the country, including in Shanxi, including in the schools. And it was at this moment of fear and violence that Xi Zhongxun, at 15 years old, was ordered by the party to commit his first revolutionary act to kill an academic administrator at his school. The assassination plot fails. A bunch of teachers are poisoned, but nobody dies, and Xi Zhongxun is thrown into prison. And it's while he's in prison that he joins the party. And the person who officially introduced him into the party suffered so much in that prison that he killed himself in Shanghai just a few weeks later. After Xi Zhongxun is released, his father dies. It's a death that's related to the stress and anxiety of his son having been arrested. He also loses his mother and 2 sisters around this time, apparently related to the ongoing famine. While in prison, he's developed a skin disease so serious he can't walk. He can't link back up with the party because it's still being destroyed. He can't go back to school because he's a wanted man. And at this moment of desperation, he doesn't read Marx, he reads a novel. And so this is a really interesting moment because it shows the power of a cultural product to inspire. Now, this is not a particularly well-written novel. I'm sure many people in this room have heard of T.A. Shah, one of the great scholars of Chinese literature. T.A. Shah wrote about this author, Zhang Guangzi, that he no doubt had his fans among the barely literate youths who did not care so much about the quality of the writing as the emotions he so frankly expressed. Did not Zhang's popularity in his lifetime constitute rather an unfavorable comment on the intellect of his readers of those days, who seemed merely excitable in temper and indiscriminate in taste? So T.A. Shah writing about the father of Xi Jinping without realizing it was about the father of Xi Jinping. It is a relentlessly bleak book. It is a relentlessly dark book. It's essentially just a series of disasters that befall a young man who, at the conclusion of the book, decides that only violence can save China, so he goes off to learn military affairs. It's the kind of book that includes lines like, "The more pain that evil society brought me, the more powerfully did my resistance develop." And Xi Zhongxun would later tell his son Xi Jinping that this is the book that he would read to reinstill his dedication during moments of doubt on the revolutionary path. So here we see ideology as an inspiration, but it could also be something more dangerous. It could lead to dogmatic blinders, and it could intensify inter-party struggle, which is why Xi Zhongxun was arrested a second time, 1935, on this occasion by his fellow communists. The reason for this was that Xi Zhongxun and other revolutionaries in Shanxi decided that the right course was to build base camps, base areas away from the cities, away from where they were too vulnerable from the nationalist military forces. And even though they did kill many people, they tried not to kill too many people to trigger a negative response against them. But then you had these communists come from the cities who had only read about communism in books, show up and say that Xi Zhongxun and the others weren't aggressive enough, weren't ambitious enough, and that this was an ideological problem, that they were rightist opportunists, that they were mountaintopists, meaning that they were sitting on top of mountains and not engaging in revolution. And so Xi Zhongxun was thrown in prison, and he believed that they were planning to bury him alive. And he wasn't released until the arrival in Shanxi of Mao Zedong and the rest of the central leadership at the conclusion of the Long March. Of course, Mao Zedong famously had created his own base camp in southeast China. It was destroyed, and the central leadership fled for thousands of miles. And it was a dusty town in the middle of nowhere that Mao read in a newspaper that there was a base area nearby. And it was shortly after that Xi Zhongxun was released, and until the end of his life, Xi Zhongxun credited Mao Zedong with having saved him. Xi Zhongxun returned to the question of ideology shortly after the establishment of the People's Republic. In 1952, he's brought to work in Beijing in the party center, and his very first job is Minister of Propaganda, meaning that he's tasked with explaining to hundreds of millions of Chinese people what communism is and why they should build it. 10 years later, he's purged from the leadership. Ironically, it was a novel that helped get him onto the revolutionary path, and it was a novel that knocked him off of the revolutionary path. He was purged because of a novel. This novel was about one of his fellow revolutionaries from Shanxi. When it appeared, Mao blamed Xi Zhongxun, who had played a role in its creation, even though he was skeptical about whether it should have been written in the first place. And Mao made one of his more famous quotes at this moment. He said, "Isn't it interesting that there is this new invention that people are using novels to engage in counter-revolutionary activities?" And Xi Zhongxun spent the next 16 years of his life in the political wilderness because of this novel. When he returns to work, the party is faced with a big problem. They know they've screwed up. They know they're in trouble. They know they need to move in a new direction. But the question is how you justify a new approach without raising so many questions that it challenges the party's ability to still command authority and respect within society. And so we see this tension between what Chinese intellectuals at the time called the three and the four. So the three, of course, refers to the Third Plenum, one of the most famous moments in modern Chinese history in 1978, when the party declares officially that economic modernization, not class struggle, will be the overriding priority. But just a few weeks later, Deng Xiaoping gives a speech in which he introduces the four cardinal principles, a very conservative set of formulations, including the idea that China will never move away from Mao Zedong thought. And when people saw Deng's remarks, they wondered, well, does this mean that reform and opening is over? Does this mean we're not going to move in a new direction? But one person who saw Deng's remarks was thrilled, Xi Zhongxun, who said that it's only with the four cardinal principles can thought be liberated in a way that is right and not wrong, effective and not formulaic. Meaning we need to have red lines if we're going to move in a new direction, otherwise it's too dangerous. And Xi Zhongxun also said, yes, it's necessary to build a material civilization, meaning better economic livelihood for Chinese people, but we can't forget it's imperative to also construct a spiritual civilization, meaning a sense of idealism and conviction and faith in communism. And so you can see these obvious tensions here. And even at this point, Xi Zhongxun still couldn't explain what communism was. He said, China has already done socialism for 32 years, but we are still groping for just what kind of road we will take. The groping might take a long time before a relatively complete socialist system is achieved. And so how do you manage this balance? Well, it wasn't easy. In 1981, Xi Zhongxun is brought from Guangdong to Beijing. He's began to work in the party center. Now he's working on the secretariat, which is the party's brain. He's the right-hand man to an individual named Hu Yaobang. That's the general secretary of the party. And as soon as he starts work in Beijing, there is another campaign that's so radical that it's raising questions. The reason it's terrible timing is that on the day he's invited to go, for the very first time, Chinese soldiers kill Indian soldiers on the China-India border. While Xi Zhongxun is traveling in the Soviet Union, Moscow releases a statement that takes a neutral position between China and India, even though the Soviets and the Chinese are in a formal military alliance. And on the day that that statement is released, Xi Zhongxun cuts his trip to the Soviet Union short and returns to China. A few weeks later, Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, visits Beijing, and Mao Zedong says to him, "Your statement made the imperialists happy." Now, Mao is the kind of person, when people disagree with him, he didn't interpret it as reasonable people coming to reasonable different conclusions. He looked for something different, looked for the deeper implications. And the conclusion that he reached was that something had gone wrong with the October Revolution and that the Soviets weren't really communists anymore. They were something else. They were revisionists. And in 1962, one of the reasons Mao had such a strong reaction to this novel that Xi Zhongxun was associated with was his preoccupation with class struggle. And when Xi Zhongxun was purged, one of the accusations had to do with the novel, and another one was that he had engaged in espionage for the Soviet Union, that he was a Soviet spy. When Xi Zhongxun is rehabilitated and he's working in Beijing, one of his tasks at the Secretariat is managing China's relationship with foreign leftist, revolutionary, and communist parties. And now they have the opposite problem, which is that they're using the market to allocate resources within society, and they're vulnerable to charges that they're revisionist. And so it's very important for the party to reestablish ties with other communist parties, ties that had been sundered during the Mao era because of radicalism in Chinese foreign policy. And Xi Zhongxun is the one who's putting these relationships back together. But as China is rejoining the global left, it's a moment of crisis for communism everywhere in the world. In 1988, he meets with representatives from Poland. The same day he meets with them is the same day that for the first time since 1981, the Solidarity protests reemerge. And he says to the Poles that reform waits for no one. Just a few weeks later, Solidarity was legal, and shortly after that, there was no more communism in Poland anymore. Naturally, he's also looking at the Soviet Union. According to the Italian Communist Party archives in Rome, Xi Zhongxun told an Italian senator that he was very impressed with Mikhail Gorbachev. After the nuclear disaster in Chernobyl, Xi Zhongxun writes a notification that says, "We also have a lot of problems like this. It's certainly the case that radiation, that bureaucratism is a bigger problem than radiation." So as communism is falling apart, you may wonder whether Xi Zhongxun is afraid that China will collapse as well. And his answer is that China is different. Why? Because China, unlike in Eastern Europe, was able to combine the universality of Marxism with the peculiarities of China's national condition. Now, he doesn't say how much is Marx, he doesn't say how much is China. He just says that unlike in other places, they were able to indigenize Marxism, to make it Chinese. And he also blames the West for what's happening. He says that an adverse current of negating socialism has appeared in the world. It's the international hostile forces who are more intensively pursuing regime change in an attempt to subvert and sabotage socialism. So in other words, during Xi Zhongxun's first tour of duty in Beijing, he's watching the beginning of the end of China's communion with global communism. And by the end of his second tour of duty in Beijing in the 1980s, he's watching the collapse of communism itself all over the world. But not in North Korea. And here Xi Zhongxun also plays an interesting role. At first, the Chinese were skeptical of the dynastic succession. They didn't want Kim Il-sung to hand over power to his son, Kim Jong-il. Finally, the Chinese come around, and the person they sent to North Korea to signify their acceptance was Xi Zhongxun. Interestingly, when he met with Kim Il-sung, who was 1 year older, Kim used that opportunity to press Xi Zhongxun to talk about how he had suffered during the Cultural Revolution. And Xi Zhongxun typically didn't like to talk about it, but he talked about it with Kim Il-sung. Xi Zhongxun also used this opportunity to pressure Kim Il-sung to think about economic reform. You'll remember that Xi Zhongxun played a role in the creation of the special economic zones. He encouraged Kim Il-sung to think about the same thing, but it didn't work. We know from the East German archives that when Kim Il-sung met with Erich Honecker, he said to Honecker that the Chinese are revisionists, they're not really communists anymore. By the way, 1 year later, when Kim Jong-il, the successor, visited China, he was hosted by Xi Zhongxun. They went to a performance of Arirang, the Korean nationalist song. You can see a picture of them sitting together smiling, and the person who performed that song was a young woman named Peng Liyuan, who 4 years later would marry Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping would show that video to Kim Jong-un in 2018 when he visited China for the first time. So North Korea survives, the Soviet Union does not. And when it collapses, it's like a chocolate bar, and the creases are along ethnic lines. And that's something that Xi Zhongxun would have paid very close attention to, because within the party, you had different kinds of experts, experts on the economy, experts on culture, experts on the military. But Xi Zhongxun was one of the leading figures, if not the leading figure, in the United Front, which was the party's outreach influence campaigns against business people, nationalists, but especially ethnic minorities. Why was Xi Zhongxun seen as a United Front expert? Well, in the last years of the 1940s and the early years of the 1950s, Xi Zhongxun is the leader of the so-called Northwest Bureau, which includes a giant swath of the country. Xinjiang, inhabited by Muslim Uyghurs, but also Tibetan regions of Qinghai and Gansu. And so Xi Zhongxun said that to work in the Northwest means doing ethnic work. And as the party is expanding into these territories, it's very bloody. They kill a lot of people. But they're also learning that there are more and less costly ways of projecting power. And one less costly way is to find people who have respect in their communities and work with them as a bridge, to ally with them. In fact, Xi Zhongxun came up with the slogan, using feudalism to oppose feudalism. One such target was the Panchen Lama. So I'm sure everyone in this room has heard of the Dalai Lama, but the second most prominent figure in Tibetan Buddhism is the Panchen Lama. And he was a very young man in Qinghai during this period, and the very first senior revolutionary he ever met was Xi Zhongxun. And it began a decades-long relationship that was instrumental in some ways, but I think also included some genuine elements of friendship as well. Once the party is in these areas, they're not quite sure how quickly to move. The leadership in Xinjiang start pursuing land reform in nomadic areas, and they start to expand repression and kill more people, even though Xi Zhongxun had told them not to. And Xi Zhongxun purges Xinjiang leadership for being too radical. When he's working for Zhou Enlai in the 1950s at the State Council, he spends a huge amount of his time on ethnic politics. But by 1958, the United Front is over. In exactly those territories of the Northwest that Xi Zhongxun had helped incorporate into the regime, the party is fighting a literal war against ethnic minorities. And these figures who had been targets of the United Front are now facing incarceration or execution. 1959, socialist transformation extends also into the Tibet Autonomous Region after the Dalai Lama flees to India. And it's so bloody that Xi Zhongxun's old associate, the Panchen Lama, writes a letter to the leadership saying that Tibetan Buddhism is being destroyed. And Zhou Enlai sends Xi Zhongxun to talk about this problem with him. Remarkably, these documents have leaked. We have the transcripts, and we see Xi Zhongxun talking to the Panchen Lama in very conciliatory terms. He says, as angry as you want to be, we will accept your anger. It's good that you're angry and you're telling us, because the Dalai Lama always smiled, didn't tell us when he disagreed, but he ran away. He was a traitor. The fact that you are open with how you feel shows that you're better than the Dalai Lama. And he says, of course, you need to be careful. You can't say that we're deliberately destroying Tibetan Buddhism. You need to recognize that these were accidents. that often come with any campaign. Campaigns tend to go too far. Fortunately for Xi Zhongxun and the Panchen Lama, the year that the Panchen Lama wrote that letter was 1962, right when Mao Zedong was preoccupied with the problem of class struggle. And Mao concludes that the only reason the Panchen Lama was so brazen was that people like Xi Zhongxun were too nice to him, that Xi Zhongxun was an accommodationist. And so, along with the novel, along with being a spy for the Soviet Union, another accusation against Xi Zhongxun was that he had led an anti-party clique within the United Front Work Department. When he's rehabilitated in the 1980s, he spends about 70% of his time on ethnic politics. And the party knows that there are a lot of very unhappy Uyghurs and Tibetans and Mongols and other ethnic minorities because of the persecution that they faced during the Cultural Revolution. And they're trying to find a resolution to this problem. In 1981, in Kashgar, in Xinjiang, Uyghurs protest. Xi Zhongxun picks up the phone in Beijing, calls the local military commander, and says, don't kill anyone. Find Uyghurs who have respect in their community to calm them down, and it works. And it begins this new approach. Acknowledging grievances, addressing grievances, letting religion into the open so it can be better controlled, reestablishing the United Front, working with the same figures who had just been persecuted for many years, and economic development, economic growth. And at first, it looks like it's working. You don't see protests. And then in 1985, 1986, you see people in the streets again, and the party is faced with a puzzle. Why this is happening? Well, one hypothesis is that, well, these grievances were even worse than we thought. We need to work even harder to win these people over. And you know what? When people protest, that's normal. People are people. Sometimes they get excited. And you know what? We're moving to a new equilibrium. Inevitably, there are going to be some speed bumps as we resolve these issues. But another possible response is, why are they protesting now when we're being so nice to them? It must be because they're not motivated by real grievances. They're bad people. They're splitists, and they're put up to it by the West. And so Xi Zhongxun, he had competing impulses within himself. He also thought that maybe we need to tighten things a little bit, but he didn't want to give up on the approach entirely, yet it wasn't his choice to make. In March of 1989, Deng Xiaoping declares martial law in Tibet, and it ends this period of experimentation. The 1980s were also a moment of possibility and exploration with regards to politics at the very heart of the party within Zhongnanhai, within the elite. And the reason for that was, after Mao's death, they didn't want to see another dictator. They didn't want to see another bully. Nevertheless, Deng Xiaoping emerged as a dictator in ways that deeply disappointed people within the elite, especially and including Xi Zhongxun, the father of Xi Jinping. And so succession politics remained explosive. The relationship between the leader and his deputies remained explosive. And the question is why? Why was it so hard for the party to resolve this problem? And a good person to ask this question would be Xi Zhongxun. Why? Well, in the 1950s, he worked for Zhou Enlai. In the 1980s, he worked for Hu Yaobang. So he was the chief implementer to the chief implementer twice. Now, at this moment, you may wonder why the center invited someone to come talk to you about someone who wasn't at the top, someone who just did what he was told. Maybe you would be more interested in hearing about Mao or Deng or someone else. But I think that what Xi Zhongxun's life shows is that it was much, much more complicated than that for these deputies. And that, in fact, they found themselves in a nightmarish policy environment. Why? Well, even now, when you read party documents, you'll see this kind of thing where they say, do this, but also do that. But they don't say what matters more or how to achieve them. If you go too far in one direction or the other, that's an ideological problem. You're a leftist or a rightist. Whatever you're supposed to manage, if you screw that up, you get blamed for it. Meanwhile, you have other people within the elite complaining about you to the top leader, and then you have the top leader who's distant, mercurial, suspicious. So what do you do with a boss like that? Well, one possibility is you hug them and you report to them all the time. But then the top leader thinks, why do I have a deputy if they can't make any decisions? I'm getting old. I can't kill myself working this hard. And I want to think big thoughts about communism. I don't want to get tied down in the nitty-gritty details. Okay, so then you don't report enough, and then you're accused of creating new headquarters within the party. right? And Xi Zhongxun would have seen these pathologies over and over and over again. I'll just give a couple examples. January 1958, the eve of the Great Leap Forward, the famine. Zhou Enlai, Xi Zhongxun's boss, gives a 5-hour self-criticism, saying that he didn't understand what Mao wanted. After that, people see Zhou Enlai crying. They see him drinking. They see his hair going white. Zhou Enlai thinks he might be purged entirely. Other people within the elite are shocked because nobody should understand Mao better than Zhou. And Zhou Enlai goes to Xi Zhongxun and says, I'm being attacked again. I can't do anything right. And Xi Zhongxun says, we'll take responsibility together. And then Xi Zhongxun would have seen how over the next 4 years, political survival, not good policy, was the overriding priority. And that helps explain why 30 million Chinese people starved to death. Then in the 1980s, you have this interesting situation where Xi Zhongxun has much more prestige, status, experience than Hu Yaobang does, but he's working for Hu Yaobang. And so Xi Zhongxun keeps going to Hu Yaobang and saying, you should talk to Deng more. You should talk to Deng more. And Hu Yaobang says, oh, Deng understands me. He knows that I'm just doing a few things for him. Deng is the shouzhang, I'm the jiaozhang. Deng is the top of the head, I'm just the bottom of the foot. But perhaps counterintuitively, the problem was that Deng Xiaoping gave Hu Yaobang enough rope to hang himself with. Hu Yaobang thought he had more space than he really did. One fateful encounter in 1986, private meeting between Hu Yaobang and Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping says, I'm going to retire at the next party Congress. And Hu Yaobang says, okay, accept your decision. In fact, he considered Deng Xiaoping to be a George Washington-esque figure for that. And then shortly after this, Deng Xiaoping starts telling people that Hu Yaobang is trying to push him out. The party meetings where Hu Yaobang is attacked, one of the accusations against him is that he's ambitious, that he was trying to push out the old comrades. And Hu Yaobang says, but I wanted to retire at the next party Congress too. And Xi Zhongxun is heard to yell, I heard Comrade Hu Yaobang say this on several occasions, meaning that they thought that this accusation as well was trumped up and ridiculous. Now, I've explained to you the broader reasons for the fall of Hu Yaobang, but the specific trigger was student protests, young people. And young people was something that Xi Zhongxun thought a lot about for a long time. Listen to the language he used to talk about young people. This is Xi Zhongxun talking. History and reality teach us that enemy forces at home and abroad have always concentrated their goal of regime change in young people. The fight for young people is a life and death struggle without gunpowder. It is related to whether there will be successors to this socialist nation for which we in the older generation risked our lives in battles across the country to found. And it is related to whether the cause of socialism and communism will never lose its red color for thousands of years. Therefore, caring for the next generation is a major affair for the entire party, and even more so is an unshirkable responsibility for us old comrades. As a quick aside, can you imagine if your dad talked to you like this? This is the father of Xi Jinping talking. So keep in mind, Xi Zhongxun's first revolutionary act was at 15 years old. He's also thinking about young people in the 1950s. Why? Because he's raising a young family in Beijing. And these leading families were very afraid that their own children would not be good heirs to the revolution because they were growing up in this privileged and entitled environment, and therefore would be soft and spoiled and divorced from the masses. And so often you saw very strict discipline in these families. Even so, the Xi family was known for being brutally disciplinarian. In fact, Xi Jinping's own mother has written publicly she thought that her husband was too tough on the kids. And the use of physical punishment was described by family friends as futile, that extreme. Then in the 1960s, Xi Zhongxun is thinking about young people because he's getting beaten up by them. Literally, the Red Guards. 1966, he has been exiled to a countryside, to a factory in the countryside. In the middle of the night, Red Guards from another province show up at his dormitory, kidnap him, put a mask on his face, throw him on a train, and drag him to Xi'an in Shanxi, where they detain him in a university dormitory for several months and only let him out to go to struggle sessions where he's subjected to physical and emotional punishment. Then in the 1980s, he's thinking about young people because now you have the opposite problem with young people. Now the problem isn't that they're too radical, it's that they're not radical enough, meaning they don't believe in anything. Because the Cultural Revolution has proven to be such a disillusioning experience. And this culminates, of course, in spring of 1989, Tiananmen Square protests. At this moment, Xi Zhongxun's position is first vice chairman of the National People's Congress, the Chinese legislature, and the last best hope, both among the leadership and among the students, for a peaceful solution was the NPC, an emergency session of the National People's Congress. And so Xi Zhongxun was involved in these conversations about whether there could be an emergency session to find a way out. But after prolonged pressure from other senior revolutionaries, Xi Zhongxun comes around, declares support for martial law. Nevertheless, the students who remained on the square were there because they were hoping against hope that somehow there would be an NPC meeting, and it never happened. And about 700 people were killed in the last hours of June 3rd and the early hours of June 4th. A few months later, there is a meeting of the National People's Congress, and Xi Zhongxun has what looks like to have been a mental health episode. He screams at the premier. He spends the night on the couch of his office. The next day, he rambles and rants about how he had been arrested by his fellow communists in the 1930s. Shortly after, he goes to a hospital. Then he goes to Guangdong and doesn't return to the capital for 9 years. According to a man named Li Rui, who's a secretary to Mao, his diaries are available at Stanford University. He knew the Xi family. He said that this behavior was the result of, quote, years of pent-up frustration and resentment. So what does this all mean for how we think about Xi Jinping? Well, Li Rui, who I just mentioned to you, on his deathbed, he met with one of the sons of Hu Yaobang. And he said, I don't understand why Xi Jinping is the way that he is. I want you to figure it out. It's so painful that such a father had such a son. And so I think my book has some relevance for this dying wish of Li Rui, the son of Hu Yaobang, is figuring out Xi Jinping. But I don't think you can draw a straight line from Xi Zhongxun to Xi Jinping. A man's mind isn't a pool table. It's not that simple. In fact, we can see this through the different lives that the Xi siblings lived. One daughter didn't survive the forge. She killed herself during the Cultural Revolution. Another daughter became associated with these pro-reform, pro-constitution, pro-rule of law circles within Beijing. All the other siblings made a lot of money. But Xi Jinping dedicated his life to the party, and the question is why? And it's a good question because Xi Jinping, like other princelings, would have seen how the party hurt his dad, made his dad hurt other people, and what hurting other people did to his dad. And so in this sense, it's not surprising that Xi Jinping admitted that he too went through a period of depression and wavering and doubt during the Cultural Revolution. But he also said that it's precisely because he went through that, but returned to the party, that his convictions and ideals are stronger than anyone else's who didn't go through something like that. And that raises a kind of philosophical question, which is what kind of suffering leads to dedication and what leads to alienation? But for Xi Jinping, at least, the question for him doesn't appear to be, why would I be loyal to a party that hurt my dad? It would be, why would I give up on a party for which my dad sacrificed so much? And when you look at what Xi Jinping says he's trying to do, there is an extraordinary ambition there. At the highest level, what he says he wants is to break the cycle of one dynasty collapsing after another for millennia by taking traditional Chinese culture and baptizing it continuously in the legacy of his father's generation, something he calls self-revolution. And in the context of what I've talked about today, what that means in concrete terms, for ideology, he says that what he wants is to avoid the radicalism and the isolationism of the Mao era, but also recognize that real problems emerged after Mao's death, and the party didn't care about struggle and vigilance enough, so he wants to find a kind of happy medium. With regards to global communism, it's very clear he cares a lot about making the case that China shows there are non-Western forms of modernization. With regards to ethnic politics, for reasons you all know because you read the news, he's trying to make it impossible for China's ethnic minorities to imagine a place outside of the People's Republic of China. With regards to elite politics and the dangers of succession, there is no succession, at least for now. And for young people, his answer to the question of how you inoculate them from Western values is to use the party's own history as moral education. And so I'll conclude with a small coda which is that there's somebody else in Xi Jinping's life who also saw something meaningful in the Amana colonies. Wang Huning. See some people nodding. He's a member of the Politburo Standing Committee. He's advised on ideology to several generations of Chinese leaders. He too visited the Amana colonies. And he wrote about the Amana colonies in a book called America Against America that was published in the 1980s. And he says, yeah, one of the reasons the Amana colonies collapsed was because they were inefficient and they were lazy people. But what was the big reason? Young people. Because there wasn't a good story. There wasn't a good narrative to convince them to live lives of sacrifice like their parents wanted them to. And so Xi Jinping says at the moment of maximum vulnerability for any revolutionary regime, any new dynasties, the third and fourth generation, which is China's current young people. And so he's calling on them to think about lives of putting something bigger than themselves at the center of their lives. Rejuvenation, eating bigness, collectivist values. And I think that's meaningful to many Chinese people. I think it's human to find something meaningful in that. But also we're getting a sense from other young Chinese people that they're exhausted, that the competition, the involution is bringing them to a place where it raises questions about how open they're going to be to the way Xi Jinping is talking about the future. So I'll stop there. Shall I take questions?
You should take questions, and we have a microphone that goes around. Oh, the microphone in the sky will take care of it. Okay. So yes, please.
Ron, please.
Only reason I want to ask the first question is I have to go from this really brilliant lecture on internal party politics to talk to my financial advisor about,
My book was so expensive.
yeah, something else. So, and so much resonates with Soviet party history as well. And I was wondering, because at one point you gave, this is a brilliant historical lecture, but at one point you actually gave a kind of complex model of the way a kind of authoritarian single party regime would work through different kinds of crises. And I was wondering if you could elaborate that a bit and think about the question, the matter of vagueness of the leaders' speeches. That is, there's something to be said, and there's a literature on this, about not being able to give a single meaning to what the leader is saying, and yet you have to sort of try to move toward the leader, right? I think that might be added to your thing, but yeah, I'd love to hear what you think.
So that's a wonderful question, and I know you've thought about this a lot in the context of Stalin and also ideology, and how there's a double ambiguity there. One ambiguity is what does the leader mean, and the other ambiguity is how do we interpret these ideological guidelines, right? And so the leader ambiguity has to do with, as you were saying, that often the case is people aren't really sure how to interpret what the boss tells them. And then the question is, well, why isn't the boss more clear? Or why isn't it easier for them to figure things out? I mean, this is a dictatorship. Like, presumably the dictator would want them to know exactly what to do. I think there are several reasons for this, right? One is the dictator wants to figure out whether you can figure it out on your own, right? So somebody once said about LBJ, maybe it was Robert Caro, that LBJ hated to be understood, right? And the meaning there was he didn't want people to know what he was about because he wanted to see how people were reacting to him to get a sense of what people really thought and how reliable they were, right? And so when Mao doesn't say exactly what he wants, often it's to see who is doing the best job of intuiting what he wants. And so this gets back to what people used to say about Hitler, which is working towards the Führer, right? The game is to figure out what the top leader wants and bring it to him better than anyone else, right? So that's one thing. The other is often the top leader isn't really sure what they want in the first place, right? And so one of the ways you would succeed is you would take these vague utterances and make them systematic, right? That's how people like Zhang Chunxiao won over Mao, is he would kind of listen to see what Mao was saying, and Mao would have some kind of like vague general sensibilities, and then Zhang Chunxiao would say, here's Mao Zedong's Sixiang, here's Mao Zedong thought. And then Mao would say, yeah, that's exactly what I meant. You put it even better than I did, right? And now it's very careful. You have to be very careful. Because if you put words in his mouth, then you're in trouble, right? And so Zhang would say, I'm just a secretary, right? The other thing is if you're vague, it allows a little bit for experimentation, right? It gives people a chance to sort of figure things out on your own. So if you're running a country of 1.5 billion people, if you tell everyone exactly what to do all the time, that's a recipe for disaster because you need to have some flexibility, right? And so that's another sort of dilemma, right? And there was just a great article in China Quarterly about this, which is like, yeah, Xi Jinping is tightening things, and like you can get in bigger trouble for not experimenting, but you can also get in trouble. I'm sorry, you can get in trouble for experimenting, but you can also get in trouble for not experimenting. So now, so like you can't solve the problem, right? Like it's a dilemma that you have different takes on. The other is if you are vague, then you can tell people who screw up that they screwed up because they didn't listen to you, not because they did what you told them, right? And so even if you are very specific and somebody goes and does something and then it turns out to be a disaster, you can say, well, that's not what I meant. So those are some reasons why they're sort of vague, right? And this also gets into the question of succession politics, right? Which is you want to make sure that whoever comes next is exactly on board with what you're doing. And so one of the ways you do that is by playing a koi cowboy a little bit about that. And then ideology, right? As you were saying, like, as you've written about, like we used to have this idea that ideology had a teleological influence on the trajectory of communist states, right? Like there was something in the DNA of the October Revolution that meant Stalin was inevitable and this was inevitable. And as you say, yeah, they had sensibilities about things. They were communists, they were Bolsheviks, and that means something. But that when they bumped up against the real world, they weren't totally blind to it, right? And as you said, you know, leftism is also considered a disease by communism. Leftism meaning that you don't see the real world and you go too far and you're too ambitious. And that also gets to the other issue of like campaign politics, right? A campaign is supposed to go too far. It's designed to go too far. It's a strength of the system that you gin people up, you get them excited. And then the question is how you deal with the politics of course correction in that situation, right? And so if things are really bad, you don't want to get blamed for not reporting to the top leader, but if you complain about the campaign to the top leader, you might be accused of opposing the campaign. So you got to figure out how you go about that. So you want to make sure you're pushing on an open door. And so this is all a story of like how hard it is to function in this kind of system, right? And I think that's why we still see in China, even now, people who really should understand things because they've been around the block and even know Xi Jinping personally, why even they too screw up and why they get purged. Excellent. Oh, please.
So there's this connection with Xi Jinping telling the China story well to the Wuxi
Yeah.
But also,
I'd love to hear what you think as a narratologist, actually. Yeah.
well, there's nothing there. And then the other part is Lieberthal-Rogel father is very, very worried about authoritarianism.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so did he not get that? Well,
Yeah, that's a great question. And we have to be careful with that question because people love to weaponize Xi Zhongxun against Xi Jinping, right? They love to weaponize him. They say, oh, the father was such a good person and the son is the son, right? And so, for example, you see statements by people like Hu Ping, who's a rather prominent Chinese, maybe dissident intellectual would be a way of referring to him, who said Xi Jinping is not the son of Xi Zhongxun, but the grandson of Mao Zedong, right? Stuff like that. Or like Li Rui, who had this wonderful quote in Chinese that can be either translated as, if you let the disease flourish, then it gets worse. That can also sound like, if you don't get rid of the legacy of Mao, then it will turn into Xi Jinping. And the characters are the same and they can be interpreted in different ways. It's rather, I wish I could remember it exactly, but I don't want to embarrass myself and butcher it. And so we have to be careful, right? Because, but then the question is, well, is it true, right? Is he deliberately rejecting his father's legacy? And if he is, how do we understand that? I think so people have said maybe he's a dictator because he saw what happened to his father and he needs to be someone different, that he drew a negative lesson from his father. I think that's a hypothesis that's valid, but I personally don't subscribe to it. I think that in other ways, Xi Jinping is reacting to the pathologies his father saw in elite politics. Most prominently was the distance between the leader and the deputy, right? And so Mao and Deng, as I mentioned before, they were the top authority, but they were only sometimes involved in decision making. And when they were, it was sudden and dramatic and unpredictable. And that was a big problem. And the other was often you wouldn't even have Politburo meetings, right? And so even in the Deng era, which I think wrongly in many ways is seen as a sort of golden era of collective leadership, Deng didn't want there to be Politburo meetings because he didn't want to have other people to have an opportunity to talk, right? And also Deng was not the general secretary. Like there was like a decision to consult with him on big issues, but it wasn't like legitimated formally in rules and ways that were that were clear. So I think Xi Jinping is different in the sense that he's both a decision maker and the top authority. You can see how that's a reaction to what his father witnessed. You can see how the dangers of succession politics are something you don't want, so you want to have fewer successions. We also see that in Xi Jinping. But also, I think he cares a lot about using rule of law and institutions not to constrain himself, but to legitimize himself in ways that Mao and Deng didn't care about as much. And so in that sense, he can tell himself a story that he's different from Mao and Deng and less dictatorial because he's at least pretending to obey the trappings of those institutions, right? And the other thing to say is his father, no matter what, still put the party's interest first, even when he disagreed with what the top was saying. And so Xi Jinping thinks that that is a party that should continue to exist because that's one of its inherent strengths, I think, in his mind. Other questions? Please.
So, Joseph, you told us a story that in some ways is a very political story. It's a story about how do leaders function and cope under authoritarian and even totalitarian in totalitarian rule. I'm a little surprised that it's not a story about the content of the party and the content of communism or the evolutions of communism. I mean, in many ways, what you have told us, even leftists and rightists and splitists, et cetera, is more a description of how people do politics than a description of ideology. And so do you consider how do you evaluate or what do you think about the content of the ideology that Xi Zhongxun proclaimed and that his son is now revising?
That's a wonderful question. So ideology is something that they care a lot about, and they care about it as something that legitimates what they do, and they care about it because they think the game is up if people don't believe in it. And so we see how much they sacrifice for this kind of organization in extraordinary and dramatic ways. And so that if you don't have people who think that there is an ideal there, then that's a big problem. And so in a sense, I think what my book does is it talks about ideology in a civilizational way, that for them, communism was a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose, right? Sometimes communism was also blinders, right? That it made them think about the world in a particular way that limited what they were able to achieve, right? Because certain options were inconceivable to them because it was seen as ideologically illegitimate. But what we also see is how flexible that ideology was at the same time, right? And so when we look at what Xi Jinping talks about ideology, he talks about it in very different ways, right? When you look at the 20th Party Congress report and how that talks about ideology, it begins with ideology. And it says, we are communists. We have to believe in this stuff. We're a communist party. But then in the rest of that opening section on ideology, it's all cautionary tales about ideology. It's about how we can't go too far too fast. And also the reason we succeeded when other people did not is because we indigenized Marxism. And Xi Jinping says quite commonly, actually, that we need to come up with new approaches because Marx and Engels died hundreds of years before they even knew what the questions were. And so dogmatism, radicalism for him is a problem, right? I think that there are certain sort of communist ways of thinking about the world that still shape him. One is he thinks a lot about political economy in the sense that different ways of organizing your economy have different implications for whether it creates forces in society that are skeptical about you, but also that there are certain ways of organizing your society that makes you more or less vulnerable to Western pressure and competition. And so his preoccupation with factories and the real economy and skepticism of populism, that kind of thing. I think there's sort of a communist bent there. But I think that the fact that we see both prominent continuities and discontinuities over time mean that we shouldn't sort of essentialize ideology, right? And people I've met who've met Xi Jinping say that when he talks about ideology, he talks about it in the sense of meeting China's national conditions, right? And he talks about it in a way of trying to imply he's not like a radical, as some people associate him to be. On one occasion, he met with Abe Shinzo, the Japanese prime minister, and he said something very interesting to him, which was, if I was born in the United States, I would have become a Republican or a Democrat, not a communist, because if you don't have political power, everything else is meaningless, right? And so it's sort of this, once again, a dilemma, right? Where you talk about communism because it's useful to you and you believe in it, but you also don't want to tie your hands too much because you've seen how dangerous that is. And I think that emerges from Xi Jinping's life story, which in many ways is a lesson in what happens when you care about ideology too much and what happens when you don't care about ideology enough. And so he says the Cultural Revolution was a disaster because it was too utopian. It proved to be an illusion. But then he also said that after Mao's death, and there was like a real values crisis of meaning in society. And so he wants to find this middle path, right? And so he uses this idea of struggle. And so what is struggle? Well, like he seems to think that it's like a dial and you can sort of like get it right, like not too much, not too little. But the problem is struggle is an inherently ambiguous concept. It's not a legal term, right? And so in that sense, he is someone who I believe cares about the economy and ideology. It's not that he cares about one more than the other. It's that it's always been hard to balance both at the same time, and that in theory it can be integrated, just like Hu Yaobang said, but that in practice is very hard. And so that might not be a good answer to your question, but it's maybe the best that I can do. The last thing I'll say is they don't talk about leftists and rightists in China anymore, right? They still talk about problems of political consciousness, but they don't talk about line struggles quite in the same way that went through the Deng era. And I think that also gets to something that Xi Jinping cares about, which is he doesn't want to be seen as someone who persecutes in the same way that Mao does. And so it's ironic that what he's doing is to prevent another cultural revolution from happening in his mind. In fact, he said in the 1980s that he wanted to devote his life to the party to stop another cultural revolution from happening. But what he's doing to shore up the regime for many people is reminiscent of the cultural revolution. Do we have time for another question or do we need to wrap up? One more question? Did you have a question?
Thank you for your wonderful talk. I have a question about it. Could you please elaborate more about the Xi Zhongxun? How Xi Zhongxun came to be the leading figure, eventually established at farm. Was it related to the earlier work?
Yeah, great question. So one was you're right. The fact that he worked in the Northwest, as he said, there were a lot of ethnic minorities. So inevitably he would have been someone who would very quickly get experience that other people would not have. But I think there was another reason there, which was that Xi Zhongxun was good at it. And he was good at it because he was charming, he was funny, he was self-deprecating, he put up with people. And those were surprisingly rare talents within the Chinese Communist Party. I interviewed the Dalai Lama about this, and for complicated reasons, Xi Zhongxun was supportive of the Panchen Lama, but Deng Xiaoping was supportive of the Dalai Lama, and that actually led to quite serious tensions between Deng Xiaoping and Xi Zhongxun. And I kind of wanted to get a sense of whether the Dalai Lama knew that Xi Zhongxun opposed him, right? Or, and then he said, when I met him, he was very flattering and very charming. And I think that a part of what's going on here is the Dalai Lama said a lot of people, when they met him, would make fun of him because of what he wore. And so why are you dressed like a feudal lord and that kind of thing? The Dalai Lama would be like, this guy is just completely clueless. Like Xi Zhongxun, the fact that he had like a basic level of, understanding how to deal with people, I think made him a good candidate for that. So one was the fact he came from that region, and another, I think, had a little bit to do with his personality. And so he could veer from threats and enticements, right? Like the United Front had to be a principled United Front, right? You couldn't cater to people in ways that violated the party's interests. But when he wanted to be charming, he could be very charming. And I've heard that about Xi Jinping too, that sometimes he wants to be austere, he can be austere, but when he wants to charm people, he can charm people. So I think it's something I learned from his dad. Will we stop there?
Thank you.